My guest this week is MilesHef, who is a journalist with the Star Observer newspaper and online publication. Correct, Miles?
Correct, and now print once a month.
Yeah, and that's terrific. And you're also a section editor with them now. But not that long ago, you were a humble freelance journalist, and you took a special interest in journalists' shield laws. Can you tell us about that and why that happened?
Well, if two of the country's best journalists, or at least most respected journalists, can be brought into the groups of someone like a Gina Rinehart with buckets of money and a sort of a tenuous relationship between why she picked those two given how they had written about her, I was very keen to see if that was the appropriate way to go. And so I decided to ask the question.
All right. So can you just background us a little on the cases that were involved there that triggered your interest and your campaign to change shield laws?
Well, I only actually learned about Steve Pinnell's after I went into bat for Adele Ferguson, and it was within a day that some of Steve's supporters reached out and said, "Hey, by the way, this bloke's been in this for a year ahead of it." So that shows my complete lack of knowledge of things over in the West, even though he was Sydney-based. Anyway, Adele, when I lived in Melbourne, I used to read her stuff. I knew of her, I admired her, and she was never known to be an upstart or a bit of a crook. And I was really interested that Rinehart had done the whole trial in secrecy. You know, wherever there was a way that she could keep it suppressed, she did, and took it as far as she basically could. And only then, when her suppression fight was lost, did she start to then attack the journalist that had exposed her. And that something just didn't ring true about that.
So the crux of that was that Australia's wealthiest woman, Gina Rinehart, was in a dispute with her family, wasn't she? And Adele Ferguson was writing about this. So can you tell us what it was that she was pursuing Ferguson over?
Well, interestingly, while there was a dispute about the family trust and the way in which Ms. Rinehart conducted herself as the trustee, the newsworthy value for me was that she'd actually fought so hard to keep it out of the public eye. And so that's what brings a journalist out. And so Adele was just doing her job by saying, hang on a second, this person is using our public court system and pushing the limits as far as she can about a free and fair trial, which is meant to be done in public. And so she was just doing her job at its most simple. It wasn't necessarily groundbreaking stuff. She got some good scoops, but at the end of the day, it was a bit of a soap opera, and she was reporting. Of course, Rinehart was so desperately trying for it not to be. And the rest of us have to go to a free and public court. We don't have the luxury of hiding behind suppression orders.
And what was the basis of the Pinnell's case?
So Pinnell's was the one that sort of first broke the news, and there was a debate about who his source was, and we knew that at least partly on record was Rinehart's son, John Hancock. And so there was a debate about whether or not he gave all of that information. And so as this got on, it was a really interesting one about, can a source be secret for one part of the story but be disclosed for another part? And the arguments then went along the lines of, no, he's a source, he's known, therefore source protection's out the window. And that was really the crux of the debate. So that's when I'd already done the petition, but I had actually rewritten it a couple of times as it went on, and I was learning a little bit further. And that's when I realised this is actually quite unjust, because we all rely on sources, and that it is sacrosanct that we look after them. And sometimes you're going to use them for part of a story because it fits, but they aren't necessarily going to be disclosed for another. And Rinehart's lawyers were taking a very, very broad approach on what that was. And that was, the source is known, you've got no case.
So, look, you're a humble freelance journalist, and I think the whole episode showed that one individual who is passionate enough about an issue can actually make a difference. So would you mind walking us through the Change.org campaign that you initiated and crowdfunded, correct? And no?
Well, there's no funding. It was just all done through word of mouth. And I guess about 3 weeks in, there was a degree of momentum where people started to understand that this isn't quite right. And so in less than sort of 700 words, I spelled out what I thought was the injustice of it, which is the most powerful person in Australia, or at least one of them, was using the courts as a personal plaything. And then when that accountability came through a journalist doing a job, then they would try and wreck the liberty of that journalist. And they're talking about jail, right? Now in the case of Steve, and I didn't know him. I met him a year later, but he travels the world for his job, right? So he would then be facing a very different world without that, and similarly Adele. But on top of that, it was about breaking these individuals. It was, okay, well, you're in this spat, and we're going to make sure that you're going to feel the full force of it. What was interesting was her lawyers actually wrote to me explaining how completely out of line I was, and they actually sought for me to amend the petition because it wasn't free and fair. So even the humble petition was open, and I would have thought the most partisan of documents was a petition, not known for its newsworthiness.
So that's interesting. So there was some legal pressure brought to bear on you as well as a petitioner through Change.org to change that. Did that go very far, that pressure?
Look, I sort of counted back, and I wrote quite and challenged them on every point that they raised with me. And before I became a journalist, I worked in industrial relations, so I was used to combative letter writing. It wasn't something I was particularly scared of. The difference is now, as a journalist, I'm also poor, so therefore I had literally nothing to lose. And the lawyer involved lost his cool one night at about 8 o'clock. And wrote and saying, what offends me is that you would do this. And suddenly he was no longer acting in the shoes of his client. He was acting on his own volition. And that's when I guess I bunkered right at that point and thought, hang on a second, this is a sense of entitlement. This lot have just said this is how it's going to be. And interestingly, when he lost his cool that night, the 3 paragraphs that he broke down and dissected my argument telling me how morally wrong I was were the very 3 pieces of argument that held the day when Pennell's employer eventually went to court.
Well, that's interesting. How many did you finish up getting to sign the petition?
About 37,000. So at the time, it was the 4th biggest petition on the platform.
And that's incredible, given that free expression and journalist perception and credibility within the community is not necessarily that high. How do you account for so many people engaging with this story?
Excluding the quintessential bad guy that Rinehart looks like big business in its caricature, there was something more abiding about it that I was really surprised watching it get shared on Twitter just who was. So, of course, it started with the union movement because the MEAA grabbed hold of it, but it was so much more. It started them being the academics of all sides, including the legal academics, and then suddenly it was the commentators, and next thing you know, it was senior journalists, and then I was starting to get phone calls from board level people of media organisations saying keep going, and then I'm sharing a beer with Malcolm Turnbull at the Press Freedom Awards, having an honest conversation about it after giving him a heads up of what was coming. So it moved from being a bloke at the Gold Coast in his little crappy place into it touched the hearts and minds of everyone, and obviously Mr. Turnbull gave a tweet that said, should be well advised to drop it, and that was a degree of kinship I had with the man.
Mm. No, that's a really interesting success story. So, would you mind explaining to our viewers where that then, or what influence that might have played on shield laws being developed and implemented in at least Western Australia?
Well, the laws were there, and so what it was a question of how well they were. And technically, between when the stories were written and when the legal action came, the laws came into effect. And so there's always been a provision for a superior court to say, hey, you don't have to disclose in the interest of justice, or more importantly, you do have to disclose. So there was a kind of a high court took an approach to it, but this became legislation, and every state has a slightly different one, including some states not having any at all, which said that the journalist doesn't have it. The positive obligation then is on the person asking the question to get the journalist to cough up. But there's still a very expensive trial to make that happen. So if you're a vexatious litigant, you could tire very large corporations out. In this case, costs went against Rinehart to some degree with Ferguson, which is a huge deal. So it meant that there was also a commercial cost with this. So the next person trying it's got to understand that a cost order can be flowing as well, even though they actually finished before the trial. So
well, that's a really interesting account. Has this impacted on your own career in any way? I mean, the job you're in now, is that partly attributable to you making the sorts of contacts and pushing that campaign the way you did?
That and combined with an investigation that I found myself in the Australian, when you're a freelancer and you only get paid at the end of the story, I guess it took me 9 months, and I investigated a fraud that helped the career. But certainly from actually getting to know journalists, I started as an outsider. I never ever was in a major newsroom. I decided I would try as a freelancer because I joined the industry when everyone was getting sacked or redundant, so I didn't really have a choice. So it's actually quite a lonely place to be. And so what it did more than anything was give me a connection. And one of the people, Susie Smith from Late Lines, took me under the wing just to give me advice on some stories. And it was what I found was a wonderful community that I think a freelancer sometimes misses out on, because most freelancers have been made redundant and are paying their way that way.
Well, I mean, that's an upside, of course, and it's great to see that a side benefit of following your principles and pursuing a cause that is so important can actually be developing better contacts and learning more about the industry that way. So, well done.
Yeah, look, and the shield laws for me, one issue is that I don't necessarily agree that there should be a full whack shield laws where there is absolutely no consequence for a journalist, because then you've got us, like a makeup. Yeah, I spoke to this bloke, he's a source. I won't tell you who it is, it's my little secret. So I understand why people want to challenge a journalist, but there's got to be a midpoint between that. And expensive trials aren't it. And the vocation of journalism is an important one. It delivers an important service, but we also need to make sure that we can't just be exempt from the hand of justice either.
All right, Miles. Well, look, thanks so much for explaining that to us today, and I'm sure we all understand both shield laws and this sort of grassroots campaign much better. Thank you.
Thanks, mate. See ya.